most of those teams, they would have one or two cars, not more. It's not like today where if a car crashes, if Mick Schumacher in 2022 crashes his house for the fifth time of the weekend, there's a sixth one they can build in 5 hours, 6 hours. It's incredible nowadays because you used to have to be so careful if you were a privateer, because one crash a week before a Grand Prix could mean that you're not entering the next one, or you have to use some 2-year-old chassis or whatever. And that's basically what he had to do for a race in Austria. And then he got a new chassis, and that chassis was so bad. So he got it from the Carlsen team, and it was rebuilt by Delara, the famous kind of race car maker. So they made the Merzario A4, and it was atrocious and basically ended the team's tenure into F1. So it's incredible to think that for those privateers, crushing one or two cars might just lead to the end of the road for them. It's as simple as that. It's not like nowadays where you can at least survive. Usually, I know recently with the Braun GP documentary, we also saw how we got a reminder of how even in the late 2000s and obviously early 2010s with the backmarkers, you had to be careful about actual car not being able to race because you don't have enough components. And that's what happened with Merzario.
That was a thing that happened in the 70s. It was very much. It was basically. I think Enzo Ferrari coined the term garageistas because it was just a bunch of blokes in a garage from probably Norfolk or wherever they were from in the UK or Italy or whatever, and they were just bolting the car together in a garage and on a cash-strapped budget. I mean, going back to your point about the Merzario A4, I mean, when you mentioned Carlsen, I chuckled because Carlsen was known for being absolutely terrible. I mean, basically what from what I remember when I did a kind of half video on them, I remember what happened was, I think because obviously they came in I think it was 1979 they came in. They basically copied the Lotus 78 chassis. They said, "Oh, we've seen this guy, or we've seen this team dominate with a chassis. Let's just copy it." So they got some designers to copy it, but their budget and the fact that they were cutting corners meant that they created one of the worst chassis in F1 history. I think at best they were like 9 seconds off the pace. So the fact that Merzario bought a car that was 9 seconds off the pace and thought they could do anything with it other than stick it as a teapot on the mantelpiece, I don't know why he took that decision.
I mean, to be fair, the car looks good. I mean, look at the pictures of it because it's got this nice kind of matte black with a red and yellow stripes going down it. So they got that down. But yeah, this is an interesting point actually, and this applies to Merzario as well. Is the 78, 79 was the transition to ground effect. Because they built their first car in 78, which, like everyone else's, ended up basically becoming obsolete because that was when the Lotus 79 came in, which kind of got the flexible skirts, and then everyone was like, okay, now we need to copy this. So in 1979, everyone else does ground effects. But you had teams like Carlsen where they try and copy it, and even ATS, they made their own attempt. I think because a lot of people, other than like Gordon Murray, a lot of people hadn't really worked out what they were doing, because you couldn't see what the underside of the car. ATS basically put skirts on the side of the car, but I don't think they put aerofoils in. So they just created a tube on the side of the car that doesn't actually do anything because they didn't realize what was going on. And so that kind of, this is where everyone was trying to go in the direction of building them. But Merzario's, like, again, they had ground effects on the 79 car, but it maybe wasn't so good because they still had these enormous wings and very, very high airbox. Even though it was banned, they've got like two square slits of air behind the driver. So it's kind of a slightly odd design in many ways.
It's funny, we were talking about how some drivers would just make their own team to just not retire. The only time the A4 that lost Merzario, that race in F1, was not slowest was because Hector Rebaque's team was slower. Another backmarker, which I'm sure Nedza will probably touch upon in maybe one of his own episodes or in our podcast again, a team that is the prime example of what we were talking about earlier in terms of why do some of those drivers or just people generally make those teams in the 70s. The Rebaque was extremely slow and was a bit of a laughing stock at some point at the start of its of its tenure, so in 1978, because it couldn't even qualify in the first half of 1978, and then it gets a point in Germany. So it still somehow just gets a point from a random race of attrition. And I think the person who, he scored the only point of his team, and he finished a minute and a half behind top two. So when you look at those examples, it just shows you why those teams even existed. It was this desperate hope that a point could happen somewhere for some reason.
I mean, Rybak was a different story because Hector Rybak, rather than ending his career by starting his own team, he started his. From what I think he might have done like one race for March or Ensign or another small team in the '76 season, but I think in '77 he created Rybak to propel his own F1 career, and then later went on to drive for Brabham, which is what everyone mainly knows him for because of James Hunt saying that Rybak is not a world-class driver in any way. Because that's what he said. I think it was at the Brazilian Grand Prix in '81, where he said because Rybak was teammate to Nelson Piquet and was holding up. I think it was either John Watson or Carlos Reutemann who was holding up in that race, and James Hunt, being James Hunt, said this guy is worthless. Why is he in the top car?
Yeah. Meanwhile, his teammate won the championship. It was that sort of thing because his team. I mean, he was interesting in terms of people imitating Lotus. Is he literally just took it because he bought the Lotus 78 in 1978, so the year after it was used. And then he managed to get the Lotus 79 for 1979. I mean, by that point, though, obviously, partly his own driving skill, but also how quickly the cars developed, they were basically obsolete. Because in 1978, he scored 1 point and had several failures to qualify. 1979, only 2 failures to qualify, but then he did enter his own car, which was the Rybak HR100, which itself, I think the base car was a Lotus 79. And that did only 3 races, and he failed to qualify for 2 of them. So it just kind of shows more quickly how first of all, how quickly the cars were developing, but also you really needed to know what you were doing in terms of design and actually how to make this work rather than just rather crudely copying the likes of Ferrari, Williams, and Lotus that had these like top tier mechanics and engineers.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of the thing of the time to just copy and I mean, we saw with Tracing Point a couple of years ago, and we've seen it a couple of times before, where teams will just copy whatever's popular. I mean, it is basically the thing of F1. If you can't get it banned, you copy it, and that is very much what they did back in the '70s. Like as you said with Merzario, with Rybak. I'm trying to think of another. I think there must have been some other team that used like a Lotus chassis. I can't think, but I think every team was trying to get a bit of the Lotus 78, 79 pie. And because Lotus were the pioneers of that time, I think that kind of went through up until the 88 chassis of 1980, where I think the FIA had finally had enough of Colin Chapman finding loopholes in rule sets, and that's where he went to the whole DeLorean scandal and the whole thing surrounding his death.
I mean, the 80 or the 88 was the one where basically the entire car was a Venturi tunnel because you could see there were skirts on the nose cone, and that one it should have worked but didn't because it ended up porpoising like crazy. And then there was or was it the 88 was the twin chassis one?
The 88 was the twin chassis.
Yeah, that one. I mean, the drivers loved it, and it was meant to be really comfortable because he was sat in this seat and cockpit that would just kind of bounce really, really comfortably and swing back and forth while the rest of the car's going like Billy-O over the bumps or whatever. But yeah, because it counted as a movable aerodynamic device, they had to shelve that. But that was also actually technically that was the first carbon fiber Formula One car. It wasn't the first one to race because it got banned. It was McLaren's one that year that was carbon fiber. And then John Watson has that huge crash at Monza, walks away unscathed, and everyone's like, okay, this is the way to go. This is so much safer than aluminium, which they've been using. Every team up until that point had been using. I think in the 60s, there were a couple of teams that tried fiberglass. There was one team that made a car out of wood, which, would you believe, never caught on. And again, there was experiments with magnesium, which after 2 drivers got incinerated in those cars, that was never used again. There were a lot of innovations around late 70s, early 80s.
I think the materials speaking of materials, I think when ground effects started coming in, I can't remember which. I think it might have been either Lotus or Williams when they were testing ground effect and suction cars in the early 80s. The aluminium was the sheer downforce was literally warping the aluminium, so the car was bending as it was going around the circuit.
Yeah, Ligier had that. The suspension was bending. I mean, Ligier had they'd put flaps in the skirts as well to sort of mediate it and that got done for being a movable aerodynamic device as well. So that was another reason they had to go to carbon fiber.
Yeah, they always did weird things in the 70s and 80s, that's for sure. Another thing with, going back to Merzario, is in 1980, they thought that they had made a car, the M1, that could suit both the BMW engine and the Cosworth engine. Now, imagine that was the case in the 2010s, 2020. You'd build a car around an engine, not the opposite. And they thought, yeah, you could just interchange engines if they wanted to. Well, obviously the car never raced in 1980, so we never got to see it, and they only used the BMW engine in Formula 2. What was the recent car in, I think in the 2010s, where they had to cram an engine that wasn't expected to be there in a chassis because they had expected to get another engine supplier, and then last minute they had to put another one.
Not the 2010s, but the two examples that come to mind are Super Aguri and Braun, because Braun were meant to have it was built with Honda, and then they pulled out, and then they shoved that Mercedes in the back and just about made it work. With Super Aguri, because their first car was the Arrows A23, which had a Cosworth V10, they had a Honda V8, and I think they managed to get it in, but they had problems because it didn't line up with the gearbox properly, so that meant the center of gravity was really high. You could sort of get away with it more back then because 1982 or 83, when Brabham first started using turbo engines, they trialed because they had the BMW M1, and that was the one they used throughout the 80s, which was the really big turbo engine of that era that went up to like 1,400 horsepower. They tried that for one race and it didn't work, and then they just crudely threw the Cosworth DFV back in for the next one, and so the cars, I think, because the aerodynamic and the engineering finesse was not really anywhere near as precise as it is now, you could just about get away with it. Because in modern cars, the reason it usually doesn't work is because if it's a different shape, you have to redesign the engine cover. That's going to mess up the rear wing and the diffuser, and then you also have to make sure it actually lines up. It will connect with the gearbox properly, and that affects the suspension. Everything is all it's like a kit car. It's all meant to go together, whereas back then you could be a bit more hodgepodge.